I've been in the museum for over 30 years. That there's so much that you don't get to see in many museums. And that needs resources as well, also has a great significance. In this museum, we've actually seen staff reductions that bring us to the level that we're lower than we were 100 years ago when there were 5 people working here. When I started 30 years ago, there were 9. There are now 3. Well, of the National Museum premises that I've worked in, 3 of them have had people executed on the site. There have been people who will swear blind there are presences and ghosts and spirits in the various buildings. As scientists, we don't believe a word of any of that. This is an army barracks complex. We have one of the buildings that was a dormitory. There are other parts of the complex where people now have very swanky apartments, and they may not realize that those were hospital buildings where lots of people died, or that there was a mortuary, which is one of the nicer looking apartments on the block. When I'm looking at things today, I'm interested in more than just that scientific information. That scientific information would cover where the animal was captured, what time of the year, the person who captured it perhaps, and the species and maybe some other features of the animal itself. But it rarely gives you stories that give you the background to what was involved in that animal's life history or with the people who collected it. This baby elephant arrived in the museum many years ago, and the curator who received her into the collections was telling me that the people who brought her around the country used to have her posing with them in their family photographs. And it all sounds very lovely and romantic until you look a little bit more closely at this. This is a fairly poor quality piece of taxidermy. The wee elephant is now sitting on a shelf in a museum, rather sad, with a bandaged trunk. But when you look more closely at this little individual, you realize this is very, very small. And I don't know if the family ever realized that this was probably not a baby elephant. This could well have been a fetal elephant and could have been cut from the mother after the mother was shot. When an object came into the museum over 100 years ago, it would get an entry in one of our registers. These big ledgers were handwritten, and at different times, different curators wrote down different levels of information. Sometimes that was quite detailed, and sometimes they also made detailed listings of the entries in the ledgers. Other times it was very superficial, and it's quite difficult to track down individual items. Nowadays, I would spend quite a bit of time trying to research the origin of the animal and the people behind it, and the history and the personalities behind the collection. And one of the challenges now is to make sure that that is recorded in a way that even if I'm not here in generations to come, that information will be available in databases or whatever the latest form of technology is by then. Well, one of the things that slowly dawns on you as you spend longer working in a museum is the fact that all of the previous generation are dead, and you actually know more dead people than you know living people, and you know quite a lot about them and what they got up to. Some of our predecessors started out with very meticulous and high quality recording of information as the objects came into the museum, and then there were gaps when that rarely happened. That's one of the reasons the Natural History Museum is in its own time warp when you go to visit the galleries, because there was no effort or money or resources ploughed into it for many decades. I'd suspect that some of my predecessors might be horrified that we simply hadn't managed to get around to doing anything since they died. When it comes to the 25,000 jars of alcohol containing a large variety of animals in the collection, alcohol evaporates. Even with the best stoppers in the world, museums always have a problem with the evaporation of alcohol. So it's important to top up the levels of alcohol, and to do that, it's not just pure alcohol, it's a mixture of alcohol and water. So it's important to keep the percentages the same in the jars for centuries in order to keep the animals well preserved. So it's important for me to go round and mix alcohol and water together in the right percentages and top up jars to replace the alcohol and water that's lost through evaporation. My main challenge here is to ensure stability for a large variety of things over a long period of time. Insect pests are a big worry. There are sticky traps around the place that catch insects throughout the year when I'm not necessarily here. And examining those allows me to work out what insects are in the building and whether they're a threat to the collections, because certain types of insects will attack and eat fur and feathers and various other materials. And it's like the library at the end of the road. If people don't go down and borrow the books, it steadily disappears. And people walking around with a Kindle wonder what a library used to be. The objects here aren't necessarily going to disappear. They're going to be looked after by people. And it's really a case of getting out the message that this is a great resource. And it's not just for the high-tech specialists. We get a lot of artists, and we get a lot of other people interested in the history of their families and so on, trying to use the museum as a resource. So we want to facilitate them much more so than previous generations, perhaps, who focused entirely on servicing only the scientific public. Because it takes a very long time to get a museum collection into good shape and good order. And the hope is that when you set processes in train, they will continue regardless of who the staff are. And I've been able to see that in the last 10 years. We have new processes for the documentation and databasing of things. And that will mean that work that is done now will still have a value in many decades to come. So if we spend some time cataloguing something in this generation, that in several generations' time, when it may be really important for science to be able to examine those objects, they will be in good shape, they will be known about, and everything that we can put in as curators will be there for another few centuries to come.